David, thank you so much for taking time to speak to me. I can't tell you how much I love this movie and just what a joy it was to sit through as someone who also loves the films of Powell and Pressburger. I'm curious to you, what's your relationship with their filmography, and what was the first film of theirs that you saw, and how did you get involved in this project?
Uh, it really goes back about 40 years, actually. To In the 1980s, I made a TV film with Michael Powell. When the first volume of his autobiography came out, I did a film with him for television. And he really liked the film I made, and so we kind of became friends in the last years of his life. And so it was Thelma Schoonmaker, his widow, who was approached by the producers to make this new documentary, and she kind of put my name forward, as the potential director for it. So that's kind of how I got involved. The first Powell Pressburger film I remember seeing is A Matter of Life and Death. That opening sequence of Matter of Life and Death, I think that's one of the best openings of any film ever.
Oh,
Those first minutes.
easily. Yeah,
Yeah,
that was the first one I probably saw as well, and I just remember it being this like total unlocking of my imagination and just almost feeling like, how have I never seen this before? Growing up here in
yeah,
the States and stuff like that. What's kind of the you know I imagine their reputation here in the States is a little bit different than it is over in the UK. How are they kind of viewed over for viewers who may be coming to them fresh and not have much of a familiarity with them?
well, when I was a lad, when I was growing up, they had no presence at all in Britain. They were kind of out of fashion. When I was young, um, because I guess what was much more regarded as being kind of British cinema in those days was kind of like social realist films, kitchen sink dramas, and Powell and Pressburger were so far away from that. But by the time I met Michael in the 80s, his reputation was on the rise again. Largely thanks, of course, to Scorsese and, the Americans who sort of, who kind of reclaimed them and said, hold on, there's these great filmmakers here and they're being ignored. So yeah, Michael, that was a wonderful period for Michael in the 80s. It was great that he managed to live to see his reputation restored and elevated. Um, but yeah, when I was very young, they were very little known.
So I want to talk about a little bit about Marty and his involvement in this. Because that's another thing that I think is so much fun, is he's not only someone who's so knowledgeable about films, but is so passionate about talking about
Yeah.
them and kind of and teaching others about them. How did you guys kind of become connected, and how did he become involved in the project? Because I know obviously that he's such a big fan of all of their films, from Life and Death of Colonel Blimp to the Red Shoes he's talked about constantly. But how did you sort of arrive at him being kind of the person to sort of take us on this journey through their filmography?
Well, as with Michael Powell, I actually met him a long time ago in the 1980s because I worked on this kind of TV art show called the South Bank Show, and we did lots and lots of programs about cinema. And so, I made this film with Michael Powell for that show, but I also met Martin Scorsese back in those days, and he was on the show too. Um, so we had this very, I'd known him for a very, very long time, but obviously a lot of what happened with this documentary was via Thelma, because Thelma was married to Michael, but she's Scorsese's long-standing film editor. She'd edited every one of his films since Raging Bull. And she was incredibly involved with this film. So as I said, she recommended me to be director. And as soon as this proposal was put to me, my first thought was, Martin Scorsese has got to narrate this film, because there's nobody I'd rather hear talking about cinema. And I know he's got this profound personal connection to Michael and this kind of deep-seated love of all the movies. So in a way, it was like a no-brainer. And as soon as he agreed to do it, then the film was really off and running, and it was a joy from then on.
Was there anything in kind of talking with him that like for as long as you knew Powell, like was there anything that you were learning kind of for the first time, kind of crossing stories with him and kind of looking back at all of these movies?
Yeah, many things I learned from doing this film. One thing I loved was this whole idea that Scorsese kind of floated at me of, this idea of the film subconscious. I love this fact, that he started watching the movies when he was like 10 years old, but has then carried on watching them for his whole life. So, 70 years later, he's still watching the same movies, but in a different way. And this idea that, some certain films you kind of absorb it, you kind of absorb into your subconscious or, take into your bones when you're very young. And then, he's kind of saying, they've then continued to influence the way I think about cinema ever since. And yet, as works of art, they've become richer ever since. That whole way of kind of thinking about cinema, was a sort of revelation to me. So I love that aspect. Um, and I forgot what the question was now.
Oh no, I mean, I was even going to, go from there of like, is there a film of theirs that you have that kind of relationship to? I know we talked about, Matter of Life and Death being the first one you saw, but is there one that you keep kind of returning to and sort of seeing new things in and sort of changes its relationship to you as you grow older?
A lot of them, I think, but the one that, yeah, the one that means most to me is Red Shoes, I think. I mean, I've gone on to do lots and lots of work with dancers in films. I've made, as well as doing documentaries about artists, I've made kind of weird experimental dance films. Working a lot with dancers and choreographers. And yeah, the fact that Red Shoes is so dance centered, that means a lot to me. And the fact that they, just the boldness of what they did in that film, where you've got a kind of a narrative rolling along, and then you stop that narrative for kind of more than 15 minutes to present a ballet. I mean, nobody had ever done that, I don't think, before in a movie.
Yeah,
And then the way they presented the ballet was just extraordinary.
yeah, I remember seeing that one for the first time and just not having no idea like how they did it. Like
Yes.
I don't know if you have this feeling like watching some to me I think one of the moments I really love in the movie is showing the sort of glass matte paintings that were used in Black Narcissus and
Yeah.
just remember seeing that movie for the first time be like how like I can't even figure out like how they did this and it like looks so beautiful and clear and it just sort of like blows your mind these was there anything like that you kind of learned about sort of a moment of magic in one of these movies that you were like I I can't believe they pulled that off. How did they somehow make that you know live on screen in a way?
Yeah, no, one thing I can't get over, and one thing that I always love every time I go back to the films is the kind of vividness of the imagery. That when I talk about seeing A Matter of Life and Death on TV for the first time, that burning bomber, and being in that burning bomber with David Niven, that just branded itself on my brain. It's just so vivid as an image, and it's an image I've never forgotten. And that, if you look at a film like Red Shoes, it's just full of incredibly elaborate and sort of incredibly vivid imagery. And a lot of it, I think, is to do with the fact that these films were made in Technicolor, and that is a sort of fantastic medium Technicolor. It's a particular kind of color that's never really been reproduced in any other way in movies. And of course, Thelma's been and Scorsese, they've both been so dynamic in getting beautiful restorations made of these films. So you're not only seeing Technicolor, you're like seeing Technicolor at its very, very best when you go and see the films now. I think that's one reason why they're so vivid in my mind, because the images that were made are so vivid.
Is let's say you're talking to one of our viewers who's never seen a Powell and Pressburger film before, and they're like, they all sound great. I don't know where to start. Where would you say, as someone who's been working on this and thinking about their filmography, where would you say is like a great place for people to start if they want to dive into their filmography?
That's a tough one. Well, if you just want a pure good time, I would go for I Know Where I'm Going. Just for a wonderful romantic, entertaining story with lots of emotion, but also lots of great comedy in it. That's an incredibly enjoyable one. Uh, you know, for kind of for high drama and sort of operatic uh, emotion, I would say Black Narcissus, maybe. For vividness of imagery, Red Shoes, as I've talked about. Just for sort of and glamour and color and sort of uh, the fun of being on the French Riviera and in the end of the 1940s. I mean the whole world of that film, and I guess for complexity of character, maybe Colonel Blimp. You know, Clive Candy is such a fascinating character. You
Yeah.
don't know whether are you supposed to admire him or are you supposed to pity him or are you supposed to laugh at him? You don't know how you're supposed to kind of respond to this character. So, that's like a real fully rounded human being.
David, thank you so much for taking time out of your day to speak to me. And again, I as a fan of the Archers films, I that this was just like a warm bath to just like sit and let this kind of like wash over for a couple hours.
I'm really happy to hear it. Thank you very much indeed.